And I agree with what you said earlier. I wanted to highlight this, that I don't see vegans as the enemy. I don't see people who have different dietary views as the enemy. I agree that anyone who's working toward helping educate people about the dangers of processed food, that's the real enemy. And we can all agree on certain things. And I think getting rid of processed food is probably the single greatest thing humans can do.
Yep.
And I did a live on Instagram earlier today, and somebody asked me this, can we just eat whole foods? And I said, yes. But where the step went further for me was that I, in medical school, and actually in my residency at University of Washington, I was eating all whole foods and I still had eczema. And so I know from my experience and the experience of many people that just cutting out processed foods is not enough for some people. They might be eating pasteurized milk, or maybe they're eating a certain type of egg that's fed corn and soy, and that's triggering. Or maybe they're eating vegetables, something that everyone thinks are healthy, that's triggering issues. So that's kind of where the animal-based diet perspective came from for me. I started as carnivore, strictly meat and organs, and that helped my eczema. But then long-term, it didn't work for my athletic stuff because of the lack of carbohydrates, something I've talked about a lot on other podcasts, et cetera. So adding back in what I thought of at that time as the least toxic carbohydrates, fruit, and then honey made sense. And I think I got the idea from an anthropologist that I interviewed on my podcast.
Wow.
And he said, you know, if you go to the Amazon, which where he spent a lot of time, they basically eat fish and peccary, which is like an anteater, or like not an anteater, but like kind of like a hog. And then they eat animals and fish, and they eat fruit when it's in season. That's basically what they eat in the Amazon. I thought, okay, meat and fruit, that makes sense. And when we say meat, we mean all the organs, everything.
Yep.
And then I got interested in these indigenous cultures around the world, like the Hadza. And you read books by Frank Marlowe, who did his PhD thesis, and they basically eat meat and fruit. If you look at their most favorite foods, they're honey. Honey is their favorite food. And then the women and men are sort of divided whether they like berries or meat first or second. And then they eat this baobab fruit and they eat honey first. And the last thing they want to eat is tubers, which is sort of like in between a fruit and a vegetable, but technically it's a vegetable. So you see this pattern over and over and over in these indigenous cultures. And then I thought, this makes sense. If you and I are in a tribe and we're out in the wilderness, we're going to hunt an animal. And if we see a ripe, and especially here in Costa Rica by the equator, if I see a ripe mango on the tree, I'm going to be like, hey, I want a mango. Hey, Ben, you want a mango? Or if we find a beehive, we're going to get some honey, share it with people, bring it back to the tribe. It just makes sense that these are the foods that humans gravitate toward. And you said it with your son too. I think kids know this. And this is why I want to write a kid's book. Like, so many fights happen at the dinner table. And it happened at my dinner table growing up over vegetables.
Being forced to eat stuff you don't want to eat.
Yes, I remember vomiting in my pea soup.
Kids will devour fruit.
And they'll devour meat.
And then you find different meats they like and they devour it.
They devour it.
They love it.
It's
and
like
these have calories. Like these are
nutrients.
These are foods to thrive.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I've just found like I thrive when meat and fruit are my primary foods. And then I see the same thing my kids. I see the same things in my mom. I have friends like Mark Bell, super close friend of mine. And guys like Mark and I, as fitness people, we've tried like every type of diet under the sun. And we do best when meat and fruit is our primary stuff.
It makes sense.
Yeah, one of my best friends in the world, Fernando Lopez, who I train with every day. He's kind of like a training partner for me. And he has worked with so many clients over like 10 years. And same thing, he's tried so many different things. And meat and fruit ends up our primaries. And this guy's like, Fernando's like shredded and has muscle. And I've known him closely. I've lived with him, like 100% natural. And that's what you want out of life, like to thrive, to be able to have strength and be lean and be active. So before I'd almost have to be super low carb, trying to not have too much red meat, like being worried about red meat, maybe like sliced turkey or something. And like I was getting by, but I wouldn't say I was like thriving. So like if you've seen me on social media, you've probably seen me on a meat and fruit diet because I've spent 90+% of the last 3 to 4 years on meat and fruit. And that's when I started like just taking off on social media, productivity through the roof, sleep quality great. Because if I didn't like the fruit, then I started just sleeping great with that. So, I mean.
I had sleep issues when I wasn't eating carbohydrates. So I did carnivore, meat, organs, animal fat, and salt. And I was getting palpitations at night. I had cramps when I would try to climb in my legs. I'd wake up with cramps. I'd have sleep disturbances. I remember, I don't know if I've talked about this much, when I was in my residency, I think I got so magnesium deficient from a strict keto diet that I had hypnagogic hypnagogic jerks, which is when you're falling asleep, and if anyone's experienced this, they know this, and you wake yourself up because you feel like you're falling, and it's a magnesium deficiency primarily. And I had it at one time in my residency after I'd probably been doing keto for a few months. I had it so badly that I had multiple nights of insomnia because you go to sleep and you have this hypnagogic jerk where you just jerk yourself awake and your sympathetic nervous system is activated, and then you go to sleep again and it happens again. And then after it happens 2 or 3 times, you're afraid to fall asleep. And that's one of the problems that I experienced without carbohydrates. It all gets better when you add back carbohydrates. And that's kind of a separate podcast that I've done multiple times, so we don't have to dwell on that. But I wanted to go back to your friend, Fernando.
Yeah.
How tall is he?
Similar height as me.
Okay. So
about 6 foot.
6 foot?
Like I'm 6'1", I think he's 6 foot.
How much does he weigh?
He's like 205.
Okay.
Like muscle, but like shredded 6-pack.
Uh-huh.
Super strong, can dunk a basketball, all this stuff, like thriving.
It's just interesting for me to think about, because I know that there's a spectrum of people, right? And I think, how muscular can a human get naturally? This is sort of the bodybuilding debate, right? And one of our friends, Filippo, is standing on the other side of this camera, and I think he's on one side of the spectrum. How tall are you? 5'11", 6 foot?
5'11".
And how much do you weigh?
Probably close to 220 right now.
5'11",
215 for sure.
5'11", 215 to 220. I would say Filippo's about as muscular as a human could ever get naturally.
You have different genetic backgrounds of different things. Fernando has sort of, I guess, Cuban and some other mixture, and Filippo obviously more like some certain European that you can see. And it's super crazy story. Filippo, back here behind the camera, one of the guys who works for Paul, was one of my first athletes that I trained at my gym way before social media. And Fernando was like the main trainer with me at the gym, and we were all super tight. And now come full circle, and I'm here in Costa Rica with Filippo.
It's cool.
Too wild.
It's pretty cool.
Too wild.
And we were all hanging out at the river yesterday. But I think about that, because there's always this interesting discussion on social media. Is this person natural or not? And I mean, seeing Filippo, I think, wow, that's a bigger human than I can usually think of. I think about my build, and when I stand next to Filippo, I look skinny. When I stand next to a regular surfer, I look like I'm super muscular. So I think that there's this continuum. It's interesting to think that some people are probably built. So for your athletes, we can talk about this with food, and then I want to get into some training stuff. How do you think your athletes could gain weight? Like if you were working with somebody...
We just increase the meat, fruit, honey. So, and that's what's so cool is if I rewind, I went into high school at 92 pounds. I was like the skinniest kid to the point that the coaches were like making me like take stuff to bulk up, even for basketball. Like I was just so skinny. My dad graduated high school at 125 pounds, 5'11", 125 pounds.
Wow.
Like super skinny genetics. So now I was like taking all these different weight gainers and trying to bulk up. And I ended up with the worst acne that like scarred me for years, like mentally, and had went from the painkillers to surgeries to then hooked on stronger painkillers. I was super depressed in high school between the acne and the knee problems. But looking back, it's pretty wild like how far my diet was from something as simple as I could have just increased quantity of meat, fruit, honey, and been so much healthier and not had all the acne. So it's like, it's such great data to have now as a coach who often has to help people who need to put on muscle, because it really depends on the sport. We rarely actually see this in basketball, but in football, it's a big issue, in baseball and these kind of sports. And usually it's like, all right, well, I'm going to have to bite the bullet and wind up super unhealthy, taking a bunch of artificial crap to get enough calories. You increase the meat, fruit, honey, add raw milk to it, you can now approximate those same calories, building more muscle, less fat, feeling way better. Game changer.
And getting a ton of nutrients wrapped into that. This is something I've been talking about a lot. Last week's podcast, I talked about meat and longevity. For anyone that missed the podcast, the summary is that there are unique nutrients found in meat and organs that are essential for human longevity. And this never gets talked about with the longevity community. What you do is like amazing for people's longevity for knees and hips and shoulders. And I think about how can we eat for longevity of all those things, but also for our brains and our livers and our pancreas. And things like taurine, studied in worms and mice and primates, taurine supplementation clearly improves longevity, and it's only found in meat.
Wow.
So how can meat be bad for longevity? And then we think about creatine, which is perhaps the single most studied substance on the planet for performance enhancement. Carnosine is an antioxidant. Anserine is a valuable amino acid dipeptide that's found in meat. 4-hydroxyproline is in collagen. So many studies with 4-hydroxyproline and collagen hydrolysate for skin health. And talk about longevity. Your skin looks good, that's a good indicator of how long you're gonna live. That's only found in animal foods, but they're bad for longevity. That whole conversation is just really crazy to me. But I think for weight gain, I agree with you. People ask me all the time, how do I gain weight? There's like almost an equal number of people say, how do I gain weight? How do I lose weight?
Yeah.
And the equation is the same, really. It's if you wanna gain weight, eat more meat, eat more calories from carbohydrates, fruit and honey to start.
And your lifting might progress to more loads on the bar, but it doesn't really mean that, like, the amount of volume you put onto the weight training, the amount of volume you put into the food, it doesn't really have to be a different program to lose or gain weight.
Yeah.
It's just different amounts of telling your body to add more weight and to the bar, and different amounts of putting in more calories than you're burning. I mean, to me, it's like the same formula.
And in some ways, it's interesting because you could almost use the same formula to lose weight or gain weight.
Yeah.
If someone's healthy and they're an athlete, if they do more meat, more honey, and more fruit and more weightlifting, they'll gain weight. But if somebody's unhealthy and they have extra adipose tissue and they do more meat, more fruit, and more honey,
It'll
and more lifting
self-regulate.
weights, they'll lose weight.
Yeah.